all, I want to thank you all for coming. I'm Colleen Sheehan. I'm director of the Matthew J. Ryan Center for the Study of Free Institutions and the Public Good. A little bit of a mouthful, but the Study of Free Institutions, essentially, here at Villanova University. We have student organizations at the Ryan Center. In case you don't know about us, we're the Ryan Undergraduate Fellows, as well as the Ryan Graduate Fellows, and the Ryan Law Fellows. If anyone is interested in knowing more about the center or becoming a part of any of this, please contact me or Brenda Pacera. Or there are a number of folks here who are part of these groups that you can talk to as well. We have reading groups. We have a few scholarships. We're working on more. We do lectures like this, conferences. We support 2 postdocs, and we, in general, try to keep the intellectual life of Villanova diverse. We also support the Pursuit of Excellence Learning Community, which is part of the Villanova Center for Liberal Education, to the extent that we can. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute, or ISI, has been gracious to co-sponsor this event with us today. And if anybody's interested, they have some sign-up cards. They're a very active organization nationally, supporting students across the nation. And they're going to do a raffle following the lecture for some of the books that they publish, in case you are interested and want to take advantage of that. So thank you, ISI, very much. I have the great privilege today to introduce to you our speaker this afternoon, Father James Schall. I've been a fan of Father Schall for a very long time, and I'm so happy that we could persuade him to come to Villanova today to visit with us and to share with us some of the things he thinks about. Father Schall is a professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. He earned his PhD in political philosophy from Georgetown, along with a couple of master's degrees, one in philosophy from Gonzaga University and the other in sacred theology from Santa Clara University. He was also ordained a Roman Catholic priest, despite the order. He was also ordained because of that Georgetown order that the Augustinians here at Villanova just ask a question about here and there, Father. He was ordained a Roman Catholic priest in 1963 and is a member of the California province of the Society of Jesus. So in other words, he's a Jesuit. His interests include classical and medieval political philosophy, natural law, Christian political philosophy, and the nature of political philosophy generally. He has published what I would call extensively. He's published over 30 books and innumerable essays and reviews. Some of his work includes Reason, Revelation, and the Foundations of Political Philosophy, another book entitled Another Sort of Learning, At the Limits of Political Philosophy, a book on Jacques Maritain, and a book on the philosopher in society. He also writes a column called Sense and Nonsense. Sounds very Austinian, Jane Austinian to me, Father. In Crisis magazine, and he writes a column called Schall on Chesterton in Gilbert. Father Schall is also a beloved teacher. And there are many, many generations of students who still speak of him in tones of deference and love as the best teacher they've ever had the privilege to have. I was recently giving a talk at Georgetown, and Patrick Deneen, who's head of the Tocqueville Society there, we were talking afterwards, and it's worked really hard to get this Tocqueville Forum going. It's much like the Ryan Center here. And he has a really wonderful group of students who are dedicated to this. But unfortunately, he didn't get a lot of faculty or institutional support, and Professor Deneen is going to be leaving Georgetown soon and going to that other Catholic university, Notre Dame. But he said to me, you know, as much and as hard as I've worked on this, and I think we've done some good things with the students, said, really, when you think about it in comparison, what I can do with the students in a year with all my hard work, Father Schall does every day of his life and more. So please join me today in welcoming Father James Schall.
I had never met Professor Sheen before, and but I must say her charm went ahead of her, and so I knew all about her. And it's very delightful that you introduced me, and thank you. And it is very nice to be here at Villanova. I have been here, I think, once or twice before, and I root against you all the time, and with justification. And but it's a kind of a shame that none of our schools are in the finals this week, and so we can all be disappointed by that. I'd like to acknowledge Professor John Schrems here, who's an old friend of mine, the emeritus professor of the political science department here. And I also like, I don't know whether Tom Smith is here, Professor Tom Smith, who was a student of mine years and years ago back at Georgetown. I don't know whether Catherine Wilson is not here or not, but anyway, she's another former student of mine, and not a student, but a friend of mine, and so I'm very pleased to be here. Now, I titled this essay on living to some purpose. And I got a subtitle which is called How to Get an Education While You're Still in College. Now, there's a subtle meaning to that, so I want you to pay attention to that. Now, I'm going to start with 3 quotations, as I normally do, and I want you to listen to these quotations. They're very, very, very interesting. And the first one is this. Can I be heard okay? Can I be heard okay? Yes. Nobody's shaking their heads. Okay. The first one is this. He says, I am not sorry to have lived, since the course of my life has encouraged me to believe that I have lived to some purpose. So that's the title. But what nature has given us is a place to dwell in temporarily, not one to make our own. When I leave it, therefore, I shall feel as if I am leaving a hostel rather than a home. Now that is, as I will mention, is from Cicero. The next quotation is this, so listen to this. Cicero is from his essay, famous essay on old age. Very appropriate for some of us. The point is not that this world is so sad to love or so glad not to love. The point is that when you love something, when you love a thing, its gladness is a reason for loving it, and its sadness is a reason for loving it more. And that, of course, is from Chesterton's Orthodoxy. And the final quotation. Then when someone's desires flow towards learning and everything of that sort, he'd be concerned, I suppose, with the pleasure of the soul itself by itself. And he'd abandon those pleasures that come to the body if indeed he is a true philosopher and not merely a counterfeit one. That, of course, is from the 6th book of the Republic of Plato. So it seems only fitting to begin a lecture at the Augustinian-founded Villanova University, citing not just Cicero and Chesterton and Socrates, but also St. Augustine. In his treatise on Christian doctrine, Augustine, of whom it is said that no one could read everything he wrote, entitles chapter 4, Wisdom has more importance than eloquence to the Christian teacher. Wisdom has more importance than eloquence to the Christian teacher. If someone fails to understand the ambiguous charm that eloquence can have on our souls, he will not grasp the import of Augustine's priority of wisdom to eloquence. And two, we want to know precisely what is a Christian teacher. Is he a Christian who teaches anything at all, whatever it is? Is he a teacher who establishes only what Christian doctrine is about? Is he one who understands that nothing is understood unless his mind is open both to reason and to revelation? Even then, with the realization that we are not gods, but finite human beings. We have knowledge, but not divine knowledge, unless the divinity itself decides to inform us of what more there is than what we can know by our own finite powers. Now, in this discussion, Augustine writes, now, quote, "Now a man speaks with more or less wisdom, just as he made more or less progress in the knowledge of Scripture. I do not mean by reading them much and committing them to memory, but by understanding them aright and carefully searching their meaning. For there are those who read and yet neglect them. They read to remember the words, but are careless about the knowledge and their meaning." The end of the quote. We are not to read simply to remember the words, but to know something, to know what it means. And yet, we do not disdain the fascinating endeavor to learn rhetoric or oratory, to learn how to understand and speak words well. Words mean to us the intelligibility of what they signify. They enable us to be where we are not. Amazing, really, when you think about it. To awaken ourselves to things that are absent in time and place, and yet things still alive in our minds, in our memories, and in our souls. Now, the title of this lecture, as I mentioned, is from Cicero's famous essay on old age, the Senectute. I have always insisted that young students in my classes read with me as I read it again each semester. Now, I don't have the same students in my class every semester, but the same me is there every semester, so I get to read about old age every semester during my whole life. It's a great experience, actually. To be free to read something again, and now listen to these words, to be free to read something again and again is one of the intellectual experiences that we all should have. Many things, certainly most great things, we will not be free to, now what's that word? We will not be free to understand until we read again and again the passages that contain what they have to tell us. When students have finished reading Old Age, I tell them, now give this essay to, or better, read it to your grandfather or your grandmother. How often it is in our experience that when we read something great, something amusing, we look for someone to whom to tell it. Do you ever think about why you do that? We do it. I do it. You do it. We look for someone to whom to tell it. It is not complete. It is not complete if it is only ours. Now, this memorable essay of Cicero, I explain, binds generations together in an almost tangible way. Cicero is not a Christian, but what he says is fully human. He is indeed one of the founders of classical humanism. It is said that once liberal education meant nothing less than simply reading Cicero. What we call liberal education today is rarely superior to the reading of Cicero, something we find almost incomprehensible if we identify what is best with what is recent. Don't ever do that. Cicero wrote on old age in 44 BC, the year before he died. And actually, he was murdered under the orders of Antony. Cicero was 63 years old when he died. And looking back on his life through the eyes of Cato the elder in this dialogue, he tells us that he is not sorry to have lived. Itself a wonderful, almost defiant statement. Moreover, Cicero thinks that his life was of some purpose. His life was of some purpose. We might say that this very fact that Cicero recorded this affirmation the year before he died incites us to wonder about the same thing for ourselves. Is our life to some purpose? The fact that we are alive suggests that it does. That our ultimate origins lie in some cause that brought the world into being out of nothingness in the first place. And yet, in the order of intention, God's intention, human beings come before the cosmos itself, which was created for their purposes and not for its own purpose. As I like to put it, we look at the cosmos to understand it. It does not look at us to find out what it is about. In the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, Koheleth tells us, following the same line of thought about our purpose, that, quote, I have considered the task which God has appointed for men to be busy about. He has made everything appropriate to its time and has put the timeless into their hearts, without men's ever discovering from the beginning to the end the work which God has done. He has put the timeless into your hearts. Isn't that a great statement? That we have the timeless in our hearts without our ever suspecting or discovering God's work is almost the definition of what we are. Here we have Augustine's restless hearts that will not allow us to settle for anything less than for that for which we are created. I'm sure you've all read the Confessions. It would be a sin, a mortal sin, for graduates of Villanova not to have read the Confessions. I'm doing a class in Augustine this semester, and we just finished the Confessions, actually. We live, no doubt, in a relativist, unbelieving age, as you probably have noticed. Unlike the wicked and adulterous generations of which Christ spoke, our generations, that generation that demanded a sign, we expect no sign of anything much beyond ourselves. The sign of transcendence are literally removed from our thinking and our seeing. Rarely will we find a student who knows the first thing about classical or medieval tradition or about the content of Scripture. You'd be amazed at how many times I've asked students I have large classes over the years about like who was the Good Samaritan or name the 4 evangelists. Nothing. You get nothing. Amazing. That doesn't happen here, right? Good, okay. All right. As a Jesuit friend of mine, John Navoni, once put it, no tradition, no civilization. Tradition is a topic about which the great Joseph Pieper, now if you don't know the word Joseph Pieper, you know it now. And so you be sure and get a small library of the works of Joseph Pieper. In any case, I can give you a speech on that if you want. All right. But anyway, Pieper, did I say something?
Somebody lean on something?
Water. Some water for you.
I'll be more careful about what I say from now on. Right? But anyway, Pieper wrote a book called Tradition, Concept, and Claim, which is a wonderful book. And he said, tradition means rather not just to hand down something, but rather to deliver something that has been previously arrived in your hands, which was consigned to you to share something that was handed over and handed down, to hand on something that you received so that it can be received and handed on again. So that in a certain sense, the Scripture is what is handed on, and Schall is not supposed to add anything to it. It is supposed to be handed on as it was in the beginning. Now, our theological tradition, the account within it of what we are and what we are intended to be, is of this nature. Ultimately, what we are has been handed down to us in Revelation, what we really are, what we ultimately are. Its essence is not something we concoct for ourselves, but something we have received to be handed on as we received it. Something that of its very nature is better than what we can imagine for ourselves. Very powerful thought. A life of purpose, then, is a life of responsibility, a life in which truth and good make a difference to the meaning of life itself. When we understand that he is to become what he already is, when man becomes what he already is, the rational being has to take account of himself. To tell a human person, be what you are, implies that he has a direct charge over what he becomes. This alone is why we can praise him or blame him for what he makes of himself. No one can simply be what he is to become. You have to change. He does not begin his individual life as a fixed, complete reality without, as Aristotle says, his own rule of himself. It is not our project to make ourselves to be human beings, as Aristotle already taught us. Man does not make himself to be man, but taking himself from nature to be already man makes himself to be good man, he says. Though we can fail to be what we ought to be, we are to make ourselves to be good, worthy human beings, as if that project is already found within us, which it is. It is something to be freely accomplished or rejected. The timeless is indeed already in our hearts, to recall Koheleth. But we are free to ignore what we are. We are free to ignore what we are. We have the power to reject what we are, and in so doing, reject what caused us to be what we are. The great, great, great power. Without this capacity to reject what we are, not even God could be much interested in us. So if we are automatons, we're not particularly interesting. Since God is love, he cannot make a creature in which the freedom to love is not what operates at its highest point, the point of contact between God and man. Alan Bloom began his famous book, The Closing of the American Mind, which somebody told me was published now 25 years ago this year. He began his book by saying, no professor walks into a classroom without assuming, I hope you're listening to this now, without assuming that each student out there is either a relativist or thinks he is one. Now, I would hope that this observation is not entirely true, but I know that it is largely is, though with little intellectual justification. We like to say, as if it were a reason, that it is just the culture that makes us this way, which it is. But culture only lives in hearts that allow it to enter and to flourish there. Many think, indeed it is almost taken for granted, that by denying any purpose in things, including especially human things, in denying what used to be called final causes or first things, we could be free of the gods, free even of any norms in nature. Supposedly then we can do whatever we want, with no suspicious shadow of judgment hovering over our thoughts and our deeds. Nothing is out there to violate, which, if true, considerably reduces our sense of drama and importance. So if there's nothing really that makes any difference to what you do, what drama is there in our lives? There are, it is said, no natural laws to be broken. Yet, the liberty to do whatever we want, when activated, that very what we want becomes, on that score alone, meaningless. If I can do whatever you want, you can do whatever you want, we do it. What difference does it make? On this hypothesis, the opposite of whatever we do would be just as meaningless or meaningful as what we do. So the point is subtle. If, in principle, everyone creates his own world, then no one, except accidentally, is related to anybody or anything else in any binding or significant manner. The world becomes filled with myriads of unconnected things. Now, we thus live philosophically meaningless lives because of the way we think, independently of what is. We find ourselves increasingly lonely. Nothing is worth talking about to anyone, because nothing means anything. We ironically find ourselves in the same loneliness that was said to characterize Aristotle's God. Only now, it is applied to us and not to the God. The loneliness of Aristotle's God, by the way, is one of the most important insights into Christian revelation of the Trinity, but I won't go into that here. We have nothing in common with anyone except the suspicion that nothing matters because nothing means nothing, including meaning nothing. Our own meanings put on things are simply our own meanings. They are imposed on a reality that has no order or resistance of its own. So if there's no, if there's no order in the universe which we can discover, which is sort of what is the presupposition of a good deal of science, then what do you discover when you discover something? You discover your own mind, which is not very interesting if there's nothing else in there. All right, and everyone's imposed order is different. No one lives in the same world. This is the direction in which the logic of mindless freedom leads us. Now, in an old Peanuts cartoon, Lucy and her brother Linus are sitting on a sofa watching television. And Lucy looks straight ahead with an unusually confused look on her face. And she asks Linus a very philosophical question. Do you think people ever change? And Linus, was very pleased to be asked such a profound question by a sister that's always after him, ponders the issue. Sure, he finally says. I feel I've changed a lot in this past year. To which Lucy, bringing out a real character, quickly deflates his response by adding, I mean change for the better. It is not precise just to ask whether we can change. Actually, most of Aristotle's ethics are contained in this amusing scene in which Lucy acknowledges that Linus has changed, but doubts if he has changed for the better. We have first a denial of Parmenides' position that being is one, and therefore nothing changes, and we recognize that things can and do change, but not just haphazardly. We also see that they can change in two directions, for better or for worse. In which direction they change is the whole point of morality in the first place, the whole point of drama, really. And if we are going to change, it should be for the better. And therefore, we need to have some notion of what we mean by better and worse. Otherwise, the words would be meaningless. Praise and blame. So Aristotle says praise and blame are the basic reactions we get to our actions in the ethics. Praise and blame, the touchstone of the ethics, would have no ground for distinction if a change could not be for better or for worse. So at the heart of Peanuts, as well as at the heart of, as well as in Aristotle and in the account of the fall in Genesis, we have free will, deliberation, and decision about what we do. The Peanuts scene is only funny, moreover, if we realize Linus's innocence about the direction of change. His sister's sophisticated, if not sophistic, insight doubts that Linus is going to get any better this past year, though contrary to her judgment, he obviously assumes he can. Now, the subtitle of this presentation to you today is briefly how to get an education even while you're still in college, even while you're still at Villanova. It implies that hundreds of thousands of highly degreed people are nonetheless mostly uneducated in the highest things, even if they are degreed from the best and most expensive institutions of higher learning. It is quite possible to attend what I call the resume university, or the highest tuition college, to acquire there a straight A GPA on all of the 128 credits that guarantee a student a liberal education. And yet, most still come away with an empty soul, to become, as C.S. Lewis called them, men without chests. When I think of these things, I often recall the remark that the philosopher Eric Voegelin made in 1976 to a group of students in Montreal. He told them that, quote, "No man has to participate in the errors of his time." No man has to participate in the errors of his time. In these days of growing ideological democracy, it is becoming more difficult than ever. Even Voegelin seems to have imagined. But to follow his admonition, we have to be able to avoid them, the errors, to know that errors are errors. This knowledge is not something we can know if we are relativists of whatever variety. In a sense, if we are relativists, we must participate in the errors of our time because we do not know what they are, that they are errors, or that there is a meaningful difference between our view and the view of another. By tolerating everything, we stand for everything and nothing. So where do we go? To answer this question, I have always proposed a list of books or essays. This is initially a contemplative exercise. What I mean by a contemplative exercise is that we just want to know. We don't want to do anything about it necessarily, we don't know. So you have a mind, and that mind has its own activity, and that activity is the highest activity we have in some sense. And what does it do when it does? It just knows. Just knows. So I've always then thought that this list of books, of essays, and this is initially a contemplative exercise. And we have to know of and read books that no one else will tell us about. The first thing we want to know is simple. How are things? As Yves Simon put it in his great and seminal book, A General Theory of Authority. If you've never heard of that book, A General Theory of Authority, get it and read it, okay? That's a command, okay? We frequently see the questions proposed. Why is there something rather than nothing? Or why is this thing not nothing? Or what is the purpose of my existence? Voegelin asked these questions, as did Vatican II, and as does Benedict XVI. The Catholic mind, as I like to call it, has been unique, not only because it is open to all sources, but because it sees that intelligence and faith relate to each other, seek each other. This is why it is under such pressure today to deny itself so that it can accommodate itself to what is becoming the public order. Catholics, though this has been coming on for some time, have in recent months become aware that their very existence as an organized society in the public world, the principles upon which it was based are being denied by the culture and by the government itself. It is what I call a legal persecution, that we do not yet know to what extent it will be pursued. The first steps are already taken. It has already proceeded faster and more thoroughly than anyone might have imagined 5 years ago. And its logical consequences set the relativist culture and political system that puts it into law and decrees directly against things Catholic and things rational. Now, each year when I read with a class Herbert Dean's book, The Political and Social Ideas of St. Augustine, I always leave reading that book with this passage ringing in my ears. Dean writes that in Augustine's view, as history, quote, as history draws to a close, the number of true Christians in the world will decline rather than increase. His words give no support to the hope that the world will gradually be brought to belief in Christ and that earthly society can be transformed step by step into the kingdom of God. The end of the quote. Powerful sentence. We know this is already true for Europe in many ways, and in many ways for America also. People like Philip Jenkins and even the papacy look with hope to Africa and to Asia to counter this dramatic loss of population, loss of practice of the faith. Needless to say, the modern understanding of what is our purpose in the world, to spell it out, is precisely that we can, by our own efforts, establish this kingdom of God on earth. That's what it intends to do. If you've never read the Benedict's encyclical Spe Salvi, and we are to be saved in faith, it is an absolutely great encyclical, perhaps his greatest. And it is precisely on this point, precisely on this point. This has been the driving force of modernity since its inception in the 16th century. I have a new book on that subject, so I'm thinking about it. Okay. So how does someone manage to acquire an education while still in college? Monsignor Sokolowski at Catholic U, Monsignor Sokolowski is a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant man. So if you have never read Sokolowski, do so. He once remarked to me, and I think it is true, that all a student needs is one or two good professors or even good classmates. That is very often sufficient. This advice has to be read, however, in the light of Yves Simon's admonition that there is, quote, nothing to prevent a young philosopher from giving his soul to an unworthy professor. I'll read that again. There is nothing to prevent a young philosopher from giving his soul to an unworthy professor. Plato's dialogues, on the other hand, are filled with bright and intelligent young men whose souls seek nothing but power and glory and not truth and wisdom. It's amazing when you read Plato in that sense. There is but the other side, or that is but the other side of the advice that Augustine gave us about oratory and wisdom, not words, but what they mean. I think in addition to this advice, about worthy and unworthy professors. We should reflect a bit on what Aristotle advised us about why it is we cannot or do not understand the first principles of reason. These are in themselves self-evident, though it is amazing how frequently otherwise intelligent persons can be talked out of them. Aristotle also told us that if we have a good upbringing, we will, he means a good family life, a good moral life, he said, we will grasp such principles when we are old enough to understand them. By this advice, he implied that living an irregular or immoral life when one is young, so we remember Augustine, when one is young, will inevitably prevent the young student from seeing the truth of things which he is old, when he is old enough to grasp the principles on which they are grounded. In this sense, morals come before truths. If we do not live rightly, we will not usually think rightly, at least about the important things, because we will be using our minds primarily to justify what we are doing. Now, such considerations are why Aristotle understood politics to deal primarily with virtue and vice. He thought metaphysics followed politics in this sense, that one needed to have his soul in order to admit that the truth was the truth. Otherwise, he would spend, as I said, his time not with the truth itself, but with arguments that allow him to do what he wants or wills to do. The reading of Augustine reminds us again and again how this use of specious philosophy to allow us to do what we want to do, how it works. Augustine recognized it at work in himself, something we all need to do if we are our own problems, as we usually are. In number 73 of the Rambler, which was the journal, for February the 5th, 1751, Samuel Johnson brought up the topic of the books that young students read that filled their minds with characters and opinions that they would later be required to abandon when they came later to more complete knowledge of things. In the end, Johnson thought that it is more natural for a man of learning and genius to apply himself to writers who have more beauties than faults. The day of a critic, Johnson concluded, or the duty of a critic, is to hold out the light of reason, whatever it may discover, and so promulgate the determination of truth wherever she shall dictate. The end of the quote. Thomas Aquinas could not have said it better. As Aristotle said, it is useful for us to understand the argument against the physician, of a physician, as a more complete way to know the good sense of a truth. In other words, unless you understand the arguments against a thing, you will not really understand the thing itself. And that is itself a kind of a contemplative activity, to understand what is good, what is evil, what is right. In conclusion, in the spirit of these reflections, I should like to recommend to you 5 books and 4 essays for your education while still in college. They are not classics in the sense of the Confessions of Augustine or the Gorgias of Plato or St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians. They may or may not have come across your readings. If so, if you read them, great. The 4 essays are these. Now, these usually can find these online. I got a number of others that I wish I would have put in there, but I'll pass them now. The first one is Benedict's essay called the Regensburg Lecture. Absolutely brilliant lecture. We have the Pope who is the greatest mind in the world today as a Pope. Amazing. The second essay is C.S. Lewis's essay called The Weight of Glory. The Weight of Glory. The third is Hilary Belloc's book called Jane Austen, an absolutely beautiful essay. And the last book is last essay is that of Dorothy Sayers, which is called The Lost Tools of Learning. I'm almost sure you can get almost all of these just by going to Google and typing them in. I know you can, most of them. The 5 books are these. The first one is E.F. Schumacher's book called A Guide for the Perplexed, an absolutely amazing book. Not very long, it's 100 maybe 25 pages. I know there's no book quite like that. The second book is Monsignor Sokolowski's book called A God of Faith and Reason, another book which is about 110 pages. The third book, obviously, is Chesterton's Orthodoxy, and I still think Orthodoxy is the greatest book written since he wrote it. Puts more things together than anything you'll ever read. The fourth book is an anthology. It's called Joseph Pieper - an Anthology. It's a wonderful book. And the fifth book is the Dominican Adi Sartayanja's book called The Intellectual Life. This book, The Intellectual Life, as a book, was written about 1920, and it's about how to continue thinking the rest of your life. Even if you got a job, you got a family, you got responsibility. It's what you have to do, how you have to discipline yourself. It's a great book, famous book. And to these, I would add one of my own books, the one which is called On the Unseriousness of Human Affairs. These are, I think, soul-changing books and essays. I have others, but let these stand for now. Together, they illustrate the 2 fundamental principles of the liberally educated and Catholic mind. First, that faith is addressed to reason, and reason is addressed to faith. When we understand these things, we have begun our education. And secondly, we have a lifetime and more in which to complete it. And we do think it will be completed, but not fully in this life. In the end, it all is indeed to some purpose. Thank you. Thank you. Do you have questions?
Yes. We have time for questions?
Sure.
Questions?
Usually you have to. Let me.
We'll just wait. We're patient.
No.
Some of you students have questions and you might be just feeling a little reserved, but we'll wait.
Well, let me.
Oh, over here, Father.
I had a couple myself.
You have a couple questions.
You mentioned the book Orthodoxy, and you said it was the greatest. You said it was the greatest book since it had been written. I definitely believe that. Would you mind talking about Chesterton or why you picked this particular book? Or
Do that again. Sorry.
You mentioned the book Orthodoxy. Would you mind talking about why that particular book fits in with the others, or?
Have you read it?
Yes, I love it. Yeah.
That book was written in 1908, okay? So its 100th anniversary was a couple of years ago. And that particular book is a preview and a retrospective of the nature of what the human mind is. It's a brilliantly witty and shall I say, a paradoxical book in a way. And that there is no, as far as I can see, there is no major issue that has come up since then which is not covered in that book. So it's a very prophetic kind of a book. And Orthodoxy, as all of Chesterton, like I have a book called Schall and Chesterton, which is a bunch of essays that I've done. I've written an essay on Chesterton every month for probably 30 years. 30 years. And I am nowhere near the end of what he said. And he's the kind of man that in one short paragraph or even a sentence opens up a whole world to you. It's amazing. And not only that, but he's delightful. So Chesterton was once accused of the following sin. That some ladies told him once that nobody could believe what he said, that what he said was true because he was so funny. And he said, "Madam," he said, "whether or not I am funny or not, you can tell the truth." He said, "The opposite of funny is not falsity, but it's not funny." Okay. He said, "You can tell the truth with humor and amusement, or you can tell it with dullness." And he said, "It's much better to tell it with humor," and which is what he does. And yet he's very, very, very disarming. And so with regard to Chesterton, I would say this, that he is he's one of those writers who grip your soul. Once you get to, now there are a lot of people who don't like his I won't say a lot of people, some people don't like his paradox. You have to get to read him. But if you do, you will find that you are being educated at the very basic things. And remember that Chesterton, when he writes that book, he says, there's people ask him why he became a Christian. And he says, he grew up an atheist, and I grew up in England. I wasn't anything. And he said, I've read all of the arguments against the faith, but never anything that anybody who was a Christian said. He said, what converted me was reading the illogicality of the arguments against Christianity. And he said he couldn't figure out why these arguments were all so illogical. And he said finally he realized that they were so illogical was because they were using any kind of thing they wanted to against the truth. He said, which is what happened if you logically carry it out. So there's a certain drama to this thing of saying that. Let me say another word. Can I do? In one of my books, Another Sort of Learning, there's a chapter on sports. So I feel like I need to say that here at Villanova. And the thesis is this. I think this is an interesting thesis. Aristotle, for example, will say that, or let's put it this way, I put it this way, sports are the closest the average young man, I don't know about young ladies, I don't speak for them, but young men at least, come to contemplation in the Aristotelian sense. Now, what does he mean by that? He says that, so Aristotle is talking about the things that are of ultimate importance that are great for their own sake. And he said that when you go to a good play, so Alan Bloom has another book in which he says something like this. He says if you go to a Greek play, for example, or a Shakespearean play, he said, and you are there, and you behold what's going on, so that you stop being yourself and you behold, he says, what you are better in a play than brushing your teeth in the morning. Because the play carries out the drama of what it is to be a human being. And the same with sports in a way. Aristotle says sports are not as serious as the drama, but he says they give you an experience of something that is worthy for its own sake. Its own sake. So you're outside of yourself. You're not thinking about you're thinking about the unfolding event that's going before. So there's a capacity of the human intellect to be outside of itself, to be engrossed in this thing that's going on, and therefore, in a certain sense, to be forgetful of yourself and to be following this kind of thing. So that the contemplation that very often we get from good games and the drama of good games is precisely the analogy to what you mean by contemplation. Seeing things for their own sake because they are beautiful or good. Great experience. Great experience.
I mean, obviously you're talking about a decline of the classics. Is this a trend that you think will continue? And if so, how would that affect the discourse of collegiate education?
You mean the trend of what?
The decline of, I guess, the importance of the classics. And,
Oh, I see. Well, it's already declined, okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Do you think it's a trend that will continue?
Well, first of all, there's been many efforts to restore it. So I have a colleague at Georgetown, a lady that I know, and she said one time she's talking about, she's all concerned about the fact about whether or not the physical plant of a university is any longer valid. Why bring all these people together in this given place, and why not just leave them at home and put them online and do it that way and do it online kind of thing? And so there's a certain way you have to think about this, because this is the way it's going to go financially anyway, and already going in that sense. And there are some really, I was talking to Professor Schremser, there are some really very good online universities and online programs. And it's interesting about the church that you all probably know who Father Fezio is, but Father Fezio is the director of the Ignatius Press, which has really been a press which has kept the Catholic mind going in the last 50 years. Well, he now has his own little private university online. And he can give you a university education for, I forget what the cost is, $25,000 or something like that. And give you all the program, all the tests, all this kind of thing online. And it's interactive, you know. Now, I'm not a big fan of this thing, but I have to report it because this is the way it's going, as your question. And so another man I know, a man by the name of Peter Redpath, who has an online university, which I think is called the Academy. And Peter Redpath he says, it's my intention to get rid of high schools. And he says, we can do that by these online education of the classics. And there are many kind of smaller programs which are just beginning, which are bypassing the whole system. So in a way, there's a sort of revival of classical interest in a way, if you know where to look for it. Yeah. But on the other hand, in the schools themselves, no, that's not. You're not going to find it there, and that's why I say that you have to be lucky and find a professor or a colleague or somebody who tells you to read the right thing. Because in a certain sense, ultimately, it's up to you. You know what you read, where you go, and so forth. So that you know you can have the greatest professor in the world. I always have to. Professor Schrems and I had a famous priest who was a professor at Catholic U when we were, shall we say, considerably younger, and we were laughing at it just now that he wanted to know what kind of do you have student evaluations here?
Yeah, we do.
Do you?
We do.
You give her A+ there, right, all this time?
A machine, of course.
Oh, of course. No. But anyway, he said he wondered what Professor Father McCoy would have gotten. Well, McCoy probably would have gotten a D- in the thing, however you measure these things, because he was the guy that went to class and he kind of talked like this. God, I used to get in the front row because I can't hear much now, but I couldn't hear anything then. And so I used to get in the front row to hear him. And yet, it was the most brilliant class I'd ever had. You know, so all of a sudden, he kind of woke you up. And so I have a kind of a thing which I call the light in the eye theory. And this is my theory. It's practice. I learned this from experience. So you're teaching, I say we read Aristotle, or we read Cicero, or we read something, St. Augustine, or we read St. Thomas. So you got this class of 100 kids out there, and these guys are sitting in the back row, and so I never let students be themselves. I'm always after them. But it's interesting, like after a while, I get to know them pretty well. And after, say, 10 classes or 11 classes, 12, you see this kid sitting over here in the back row. And he's been sort of like this the whole thing. But all of a sudden, and so I'm trying to make them read this stuff, so apparently they've been reading it. And I'm trying to say to them, look, what's important is the book. Not what Schall says, not what anybody else says, it's what you read in the book is what's important. And all of a sudden you see this kid over there and he'd be looking at you. And all of a sudden it means he woke up. He realized there was something going on in that book that he didn't realize before, And very often books, as I say, you have to read them again and again. I bet I have read the books like The Ethics of Aristotle, Cicero, and this kind of things hundreds of times. They are always a new book. It's amazing. It's amazing. You think, you come across a sentence, you say, I never saw that before, and you read it 100 times. And so that's what a great book means. Now, there are books that are not great books, and there are books that are useful books and all that kind of thing. And there are also what I call these minor classics, which I try to go, that books nobody else tells you about. Everybody tells you about Plato and Aristotle and this kind of thing. But you got to remember that the great books contradict each other. So if you spend your time with the great books and you don't have a philosophical background or program, you will be a skeptic because they contradict each other. And if you've got any kind of logical head in your family, you'd see that. Okay, so that the great books need to be within a context of some kind of philosophical understanding by which you can judge them, and so that they're not just, Plato has. So what happened in the United States actually with great books theory, I don't know, Jack, you can correct me on this, but what happened with great books theory was that great books theory replaced the study of philosophy itself as a study of political philosophy, and it replaced it with the history of this thing. Well, if you start studying the history of something, and that's all you study, you will be so confused you don't know where you are, okay? You gotta have some criterion of judgment and intelligence which is not simply a repetition of what somebody said. You gotta think your way through it and say, well, wait a minute, how does this fit together, Anyway.
So, Father, if there were a university that created a rule that said, if one class is reading the Nicomachean Ethics, no other classes should do so, would you think that was maybe not the best way to? Do you think we should?
What was that again? I would say that's crazy.
Okay.
What did you say?
That if one class was teaching the Nicomachean Ethics, another class shouldn't, because of course you wouldn't want to read that book twice.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Would you agree or disagree with that? Or would you think it was crazy?
Well, the way I look at our place is I'm delighted. We got 6,000 students, so I'm delighted. If I'm only teaching 100 of them, I'd be delighted if somebody else is teaching another 100 of them if it's any good. So I don't see any competition there. What I do see, though, and what your point is that in the meantime, the two professors got and argued about each other about what Aristotle says, and then you get that kind of a thing.
No, I just mean in a core curriculum.
Well, all I say, if you got a core curriculum, it is a good thing to read Aristotle more than once.
Okay.
But secondly, that in a core curriculum, if that's one of the books you want to read, or if you had a core curriculum and you didn't have Aristotle in it, I would say there must be something wrong with your core curriculum. Okay.
Father, today you've outlined a quest for truth, and I was just wondering if you could make a comment on where that quest ends.
Well, that's kind of what the whole paper was about, wasn't it? Actually, we read in this Augustine class this year this book I mentioned, this on Christian doctrine. And it's interesting to read that book because it's not so much on Christian doctrine, but it's about speaking Christian doctrine and understanding it. But one of the things he has in there is a chapter on the Trinity. And he said, this is the central part of what I am talking about, that the end of human existence is life with the Trinity. Now, let me run this. I don't have time to do a lot of it. Let me just run this through you. In the beginning, and not in the beginning as the Scripture says it, but in the beginning there is only God. All things that are not God are not necessary. God didn't have to do anything. Oh, you all know that. The first thing that God intended, if I can use those terms now, was that other beings, rational beings, be associated in his inner life as invited to be share it. That is the end of every human being and their ultimate dignity. Now, that end is higher than human nature could have by itself, so that the cosmos exists in order that human beings can exist, and human beings exist in order that they can decide what they follow as their end. I don't know whether you've seen that new book of Father Spitzer. Now, Father Spitzer is another brilliant guy. If you haven't read it, have you ever read this book? It's called New Cosmological Proofs for the Existence of God, published by Erdmond about 2 years. It's a brilliant book. And Spitzer is a friend of mine, so I'm a big fan of his. And he's a lot of things. He's a philosopher, a scientist, I don't know, everything. As far as I know, he knows everything, like Professor Shrimps, he's like that. And but he says that, if you look at the universe is now about 13.7 billion years old, and there are certain constants in the universe that are so delicately calculated that had they not been there as principles of the construction of the universe, whatever word you're going to use, it would not have been possible for there to be planets on which there is such a thing as rational human life. So it looks like, you heard the phrase perhaps the anthropic principle. It looks like that the universe itself is it starts at a given point from nothing, and it has a purpose which is ultimately that the rational being achieves the end for which he was created, which is higher than his own nature would allow it. And that's why we are adopted sons of God. And so that therefore when you say, well, what is the end, what is the drama that is going on? This is Augustine again. He says that in the two cities are composed of those who ultimately reach their end and those who don't. And those who ultimately reach their end have to reach their end, A, by virtue of being invited to it and having grace, and secondly, accepting it in some sense. And those who don't create their own universe. And so that the question is that what we do in this world, like the Pope says in Spe Salvi, he says that the intelligibility of the modern world is precisely an effort to achieve all of the Christian ends in this world by means of human technology and human art. And so that therefore he said we've created in this world our own deathless efforts. So what's behind, like Professor Pellegrino is a famous professor there at Georgetown Medical School. He says doctors today don't know what the end of human being is, and they're willing to make you live forever. And so there are these experiments by which we try to keep us alive. And so, do you know what happened to Ted Williams? Do you know what Ted Williams was, the baseball player? Do you know what happened to him when he died? Well, when he died, his family got in a controversy about what to do with him. And so they decided that there's this I forget what the name is, cytonic or something like that. There's this system, what's it called?
Cryogenics.
Yeah, there's where they can freeze his body. And so they're going to freeze his body until such time as science figures out a way to cure Ted Williams' problem, and then they'll bring him back to life, and then he'll be on. So it's an imitation resurrection of the body or immortality of the soul carried out in this world, which is what they're thinking about. And the Pope in his book points out that death, remember it says in the Old Testament that God never intended to have death. But at the same time that death, once it comes into the world, becomes two things. It becomes a punishment, but it also becomes a release. And as the Pope says in Spe Salvi, he says that the idea of living on for 400, 500 years with, who are your friends at 400 or 500 years, and who's keeping you alive? He said, that's a hell on earth. He said, we have invented our own hells on earth. And so that therefore well, I don't want to go on this, but I do, but I don't have time. But the point of it is that the end of the thing is something which is revealed to us as the conclusion of our nature. And the conclusion of our nature is not in anything less than the restless heart, in less than that which we were created for, which is actually to live the life of the Trinity, which is what we're invited. That was the purpose of creation, and that's the purpose of creation of each of us. And that's the basis of this whole thing about abortion, all this kind of thing. That's the basis of every single child that was ever existed. That's their end. Amazing.
I think for Father Schall, a renowned Jesuit priest, to end on the restless heart of St. Augustine is a perfectly fitting closure to a wonderful afternoon. Please join me in thanking